The session is called the Vocational Economist. We've tinkered with the title of this session year after year and haven't quite gotten it right. But what this is really about is something a little different from the more formal lectures and discussions that we've had before. This is really a much more informal, unstructured session. Really a chance for us to have some open discussion and for you guys to ask questions primarily about what it means to be an Austrian economist or a classical liberal political theorist or whatever for a living. Okay, how does one go about becoming a professor or a scholar or a researcher or a teacher or some kind of a public intellectual? Can you make a career out of that? What are the challenges that you might face? What are some tips and tricks for how to be successful? So you can think of this as sort of career issues or career concerns facing Austrians. And most of my examples will be related to the economics profession and being an Austrian economist in a non-Austrian world. But I hope the discussion would apply more generally to those of you who are in other fields. If you're in history or philosophy or political theory or whatever, you will also face similar challenges if you want to be a full-time academic or intellectual or scholar in your own field. So, and we can certainly discuss specific issues facing those other fields as we go. So what I want to do is just talk to you for maybe 20, 25 minutes, a few prepared remarks, and then just open it up for questions and comments from the audience, because I know that many of you have specific issues or concerns that you're facing. I've talked to some of you about these one-on-one already during the week, and want to give you a chance to ask anything that might be on your mind. But let me begin with a little bit of background, why we have a session like this, why this kind of thing is important. I mean, really, this is a discussion on strategy for being a successful professional. And in some sense, we probably don't discuss strategy enough at these kinds of meetings, these kinds of seminars. Most of us, by nature, are primarily interested in the ideas, right? We're interested in the arguments, and we're interested in applications to current events and so on. We think about how to persuade our fellow men and women who don't necessarily agree with us, but we probably don't spend as much time on the art of persuasion as we might. Or to put things more specifically in the context here, we really need to think a lot about conscious and deliberate steps one might make to be successful as an Austrian economist or a libertarian political theorist or whatever. And we'll talk a little bit later about what I mean by successful. I mean, there's no universal objective criterion for success in one's chosen profession. That's a subjective criterion, and we'll talk about some issues related to that in just a minute. What do I mean by sort of the strategic versus the purely intellectual aspect to the problem? Well, I mean, think about the history of the Austrian school. If we think about the rise of the Austrian school in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, its subsequent decline in the middle of the 20th century, and its more recent rebirth towards in the end of the 20th century. There are two different ways we could analyze or trace out the progress of the Austrian school. One would be what we might call a purely internal or intellectual account, right? The Austrian school was born when Karl Menger published his Principles of Economics, right? When Menger came up with his unique account of marginal utility in the pricing process and so on. Menger's ideas brought the Austrian school brought it into being. Further development by boehm-bawerk and Wieser, and then in later generations Mises, Hayek, and so on, all contributed to the sort of flourishing and emergence of the Austrian school. It was the underlying ideas that made it work. Then, later in the 20th century, depending on how you count things, right, the Austrian school fell into decline because of some purely intellectual challenges. In some accounts, it was, the challenge of the Keynesian revolution in the 1930s sort of swept away the Austrian theory of the business cycle, attacks on Austrian capital theory by Frank Knight, Piero Sraffa and others, sort of weakened the foundations of the Austrian account of production. One could also argue, as Salerno has argued, that there were some defects in, internal defects in Austrian price theory, that Austrian price theory, Mangerian price theory, really peaked in the 1920s and sort of was in decline even before the Keynesian revolution, right? So there were challenges from other schools of thought and weaknesses within the Austrian paradigm that led to its decline, and then later with Mises' Human Action and Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State and other works by Lachmann and Kerzner, the later Hayek and so on, Austrian ideas once again became known and began to be propagated, and now all of the people here this week, faculty and students, are helping to push that forward. Right, so that's a sort of an internal intellectual account. But one could also give a more external sort of institutional account, right, that Menger and then boehm-bawerk were holders of the chair of economics at the University of Vienna. Right, it was a physical place. The Austrian school was at Vienna, a great center of learning, with resources to hold lectures and seminars and to pay the salaries of Menger and boehm-bawerk and others. In an account like this, when we look at the decline of the Austrian school in the 20th century, we would point to more external institutional factors. The situation in Europe on the eve of World War II, the Austrians physically left Austria, so there was no geographic concentration of Mangerian economists anymore. By the late 1930s, almost all of them were gone. Look at how the economics profession itself changed around World War II and after. The massive amounts of dollars put into statistical analysis, operations research, quantitative methods during World War II. As many of you know, a lot of economists, well-known laissez-faire or free market economists like Friedman, Stigler, all worked for the federal government during World War II. They did statistical analysis for the war effort. And as one account goes, a lot of American economists, American and British economists, became enamored of these quantitative techniques that they used during the war, and they brought them back and introduced them into their own academic work after the war. The growth of the American university with the GI Bill has really been understudied and underemphasized. Huge infusions of dollars of resources into higher education led to an expansion in economics departments, a huge growth in PhD granting institutions in economics, most of which were interested in getting more government dollars, right, which means you don't be a radical laissez-faire Austrian and get on the gravy train. Right? So we could look at, funding sources and regulations and things like that to account for what's going on within a movement. And then we'd say, well, now with institutions like the Mises Institute and, of course, the miracle of the Internet, those institutions have really supported the flourishing and modern rebirth of Austrian economics. So you see the contrast between the internal and the external account. What we want to talk about today is some of these external factors as they might affect you. Should I go to grad school? Where should I go to grad school? How do I get a PhD or a master's degree? Should I get one? How do I get a job? How do I get tenure? How do I get my research published? What kinds of journals should I target? Should I try to write a book? These sorts of issues. That's what we're mainly going to talk about today. Now, of course, for Austrian students, there are some unique challenges. Now, there are challenges facing anybody, no matter what his persuasion might be, in having an academic career. I like to show this cartoon to my first-year graduate students just to sort of remind them what they have in store. One of my favorite cartoons. But it's hard to get a good job as an academic, as a professor. So, a lot of PhDs, and particularly in the humanities, probably end up as cab drivers or worse. It's not quite so bad in the social sciences, but it's hard. So it's hard for any academic. It's very challenging for anyone to have a successful academic career. It's particularly challenging for Austrians, right? For hardcore laissez-faire types, because number one, we're out of the mainstream, right? Sort of an idiosyncratic fringe group. That raises some challenges. And of course, the laissez-faire association is a real challenge. The higher education sector is almost completely monopolized by the state. Aside from state universities, even what we call private universities in the U.S. are, typically receive over half of their funding from federal and state government through grants and student aid and contract work and so on. So, I mean, being an anti-state, being a non-statist in a state-controlled system is extremely difficult. It's like looking for, anarcho-capitalists at the, on the Federal Reserve Board or something. This is not a good fit. So that's a unique problem that we have. So let me just give you I'll throw out a few things, some issues that I've thought about over a number of years and talked to many students about, and maybe that'll help set the stage and stimulate your thinking, and you can ask any questions that you might have. Okay, the general sort of point we're talking about here is strategy. Why is strategy important? Well, because intellectuals and academics, surprise, surprise, pursue their self-interest. Okay, and one's self-interest does not always correspond to the truth or falsehood of people's ideas, right? Academics, intellectuals, like anyone else, may tend to pursue career objectives and, wealth and fame and power over pursuit of the truth. So we shouldn't be naive about it and assume that, well, all of our intellectual opponents oppose us on purely scholarly grounds. Maybe they do. Some do, but some don't. Some have very narrow career interests at stake, and they feel threatened by someone who challenges that. Okay? So that's why strategy is important, because academics, just like everybody else, pursue a variety of goals. Okay? Let's not be naive about the marketplace of ideas and truth always winning out, etc. Truth doesn't always win out in the marketplace of ideas, particularly in higher education, in academic research, where the government is the primary funder. Certainly wouldn't expect truth to win out in sort of a crippled system like that. So let me give you an example of what I mean by strategy or strategic thinking. Okay, just an example. Suppose that you have as your objective to be a tenured professor of economics at some university where you're teaching Austrian economics. Okay, just for the sake of argument, suppose that's your goal. Well, a lot of people, a lot of young intellectuals sort of stumble and fumble and hope that maybe someday I'll get there, but really haven't taken the time to formulate a plan. Right? So it's very important, whatever your career objectives, your professional objectives may be, that you formally map out and think about what are the steps that I need to get there. Okay, how does one get to be a tenured professor? You don't just wake up one day and that's what you got. Right? You had to go through a set of intermediate steps. What are they? Well, I mean, for each of you, depending on your objective, that's going to vary, but the point is you got to find out. You got to figure it out. How do you figure it out? Well, you do research on it, just like you would do research on anything. If you're, writing a term paper on the history of the Federal Reserve, you'd study, you'd research, you'd gather information, you'd think about it. Well, you can do research on how to be a tenured professor, right? Just for example, here are the steps, the typical steps that one goes through, at least in the Anglo-American system, right? And notice that, you can sort of start at the end and work your way backwards. Okay, so, what's the step just before being a tenured professor? Well, maybe it's being an untenured professor, a junior level professor at a university. How do you get from untenured professor to tenured professor? Well, you might have to publish articles or books. You have to teach or serve on committees or satisfy some other requirements. You need to find out what those are in your chosen field. Okay, well, how do I get to be an untenured professor? Well, first you have to have an advanced degree, probably a PhD in economics. Okay, so once you hold a PhD, then to get a job as a professor, you have to go through the hiring process. You have to send out resumes and samples of your research. There's a pretty standard procedure for doing that. Okay, well, how do I get a PhD? Well, first I've got to be a PhD candidate or an advanced graduate student who has satisfied all of his requirements but the PhD, and then I have to write a PhD dissertation. Well, how do I do that? Well, we could talk about specifically how you might go about writing a dissertation. How do I get to be a PhD candidate? Well, first I got to be a graduate student. I got to complete course requirements, maybe take some exams. How do I get to be a grad student? Well, first I got to graduate college. I've got to fill out applications to get to grad school, and so on. Right? So I'm not saying that these are the specific steps that apply to you, but I'm just saying whatever your path might be, figure it out. Okay? Ask around. Ask people. Find someone who currently holds the kind of position that you'd like to have and say, how did you get there? What did you do? I mean, those of you who are interested in being a professional economist or philosopher, I mean, gosh, you got a whole bunch of those around this week that you can hang out with and eat meals with and socialize with, and just ask them, how'd you do it? What do you wish you had done differently, etc. So the important point is to have a plan. Okay, think strategically about your career. Now, of course, no plan is perfect. We make mistakes. You might have to make adjustments along the way, but having an imperfect plan, I think, is better than having no plan at all. Okay? Now let's talk about some specifics in this kind of a plan. Well, how do you set goals? How do you set career goals? Well, excuse me, I'm sorry, let me back up first. In terms of thinking about the objective, right, what do I want to be my objective? Well, you need to think realistically about what's available, what's out there, what kinds of preferences you have, and what are your own abilities, right? Think about preferences and constraints. So, you know, if your lifetime goal is to, you know, be a tenured full professor at Harvard University and win the Nobel Prize in economics, you know, that's great. I'm not going to dissuade you from having that goal, but you should be aware that a very, very small percentage of people achieve something like that. You know, if you're not going to be happy with anything less than a highly paid, you know, fully tenured professorship at Harvard, I foresee a lot of frustration in your life. Okay, so set realistic goals. Think about your abilities. What are you good at? If you're particularly good at research, you might want to aim for a job at a research university. If you prefer or are better at teaching, you might want a job at a liberal arts college. If you're better at writing, you know, policy pieces or op-eds or something, maybe you want a job at a think tank. Or you want a job in the business world where you do some, you know, policy activism on the side, right? So think about what will make you happy and what you're capable of doing. Be aware of the trade-offs. Be aware that there are trade-offs, right? I mean, I don't need to tell you that, you know, most practicing Austrian economists are not at the most prestigious universities. Right? Most of us are teaching at second or third or fourth tier universities or small liberal arts colleges. Most of us are very happy doing so. But you need to be aware that there are some professional obstacles that are specific to Austrians. And, you know, if you're going to go into Austrian economics or if you're going to go into the policy world, you know, you're probably not going to be the chief of staff of the President of the United States. Right? You're probably not going to be the Austrian Karl Rove, thank goodness. Because that's really not an option that is open to most laissez-faire activists. So be realistic about what you might have to sacrifice. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, you know, at the end of the day, I really value money and power and prestige more than I value advancing the truth. Okay, I will argue with you. I personally have some problems with that, but there's nothing sort of scientifically illegitimate about having those preferences. If those are your preferences, then you might want to choose something other than, you know, becoming an Austrian, okay? Not that it couldn't happen. A little bit about academic goals, career goals. One of the problems that I think some Austrian economists, young Austrian economists have had is, you know, forgetting that our primary disciplinary affiliation, the primary disciplinary affiliation of Austrian economists is economics, not Austria or Austrian. Meaning that if you want to be an Austrian economist, remember that what you're wanting to be is an economist. You want to be familiar with the literature in economics, both within and outside the Austrian tradition. Right? If you're studying philosophy, don't think of yourself as becoming a libertarian philosopher. Think of yourself as becoming a philosopher. Okay? You need to know the current modes of discourse in your chosen profession. You need to understand how that profession works. You need to know something about how to persuade others in that profession, what is necessary to be successful in that profession. But again, thinking about things in terms of the traditional academic disciplines, economics, philosophy, political science, law, medicine, whatever, instead of Austrian, libertarian, anarchist, etc. Some more pragmatic issues. Where should you go to school? Suppose you decide you want to go to grad school in economics. Where should you go? I get asked this question a lot. Well, I don't have an answer, but let me just discuss some of the alternatives, right? The first thing to realize is that at present, there is no such thing as an Austrian economics graduate school. There is no institution that grants PhD degrees in Austrian economics. There is no PhD granting economics department that is exclusively or even primarily Austrian in its orientation. That may change. I hope that it does change. But at present, there ain't no such animal. Okay, so what Austrian graduate students what they face is a choice among two alternatives. Right, one is to go to a school where you can get a PhD degree, or maybe a master's degree if that's your objective, where you can at least study with some Austrians. Go to a place where there are some Austrians on the faculty. Right, so I mean, you know the schools where all of the faculty here teach, so those are all schools where there's at least one Austrian on the faculty. Walter Block has compiled a list that maybe some of you have seen that's posted on Mises.org of PhD and master's granting institutions that have Austrians or Austrian sympathizers or fellow travelers on the faculty. You can go to a place like that. What are some specific places? Well, aside from the ones that we all teach at, other schools that you probably know, a lot of students say, well, should I go to George Mason? Isn't that the best? Isn't that the most Austrian grad program? Well, we have some George Mason graduate students here with us who can comment on this, but don't be misled. GMU does not have an Austrian graduate program. It's a PhD program in economics. There's only one faculty member who's a self-identified Austrian, that's Peter Bedke. Now, you can take a course, a graduate course sequence in Austrian economics, which is unusual. Most universities don't allow that. And there are a lot of students interested in Austrian economics who go to Mason. But it's not an Austrian program. You take the same mathematics and same math and statistics, econometrics courses that you would take in any program, micro and macro and econometrics, and you'd be exposed to the same sort of mainstream theory that you would be exposed to in any school. Okay, so there is no such place. What about New York University, NYU? Of course, has the oldest and most famous Austrian program. Mises, of course, taught at NYU. His student Israel Kirzner has just recently retired from the faculty. Other Austrians have taught at NYU. Mario Rizzo, Lawrence White, Jerry O'Driscoll, Peter Bedke. But again, there's not an Austrian program in the true sense at NYU. The PhD students there are economics PhD students who take all the same courses as every other PhD student. Now, what NYU used to have specific funding for students interested in Austrian economics. Most of that funding is gone. NYU hosts an Austrian colloquium at which professors from all over the metropolitan New York area come once a week to hear papers, to have presentations. And so graduate students at NYU can participate in those. But again, they're still just regular economics PhD students who have an interest in Austrian economics. There's some places that, quite a few master's degree MA institutions that have a concentration of Austrians or fellow travelers. San Jose State University has 3, 4, 5, 6 people who are either hardcore Austrians or sympathetic to Austrian economics. They grant master's degrees. Loyola University, New Orleans, where Walter Block teaches, has 3 or 4 faculty who are highly sympathetic to Austrian economics. So there are some institutions like that where you can go to study with specific Austrians or fellow travelers. Now, what are the drawbacks of going to a place like that? Well, first, as I said, there aren't too many of them. They tend not to be the highest ranked programs, the most prestigious universities, highest ranked economics departments. And remember, there's always a risk in going to a school to study with a specific individual. Namely, that individual may leave. there's more mobility in academia than you think. It's typically horizontal mobility, but professors move from school to school, and then you're stuck there. Maybe you don't get along with the professor. You go there to study with the famous Professor X, and you get there, and he turns out to be a total jerk, who won't speak to you. Can you really get along with that person and write a dissertation under that person? It's a gamble, right? So there are risks in putting all your eggs in the basket of one professor or one or two professors, right? So what's an alternative? Well, some Austrian graduate students have said, I'm just going to go to the best school I can get into, right? Or the best school that I think I can get out of. So maybe look for a school, some people have math phobia. I think the degree of math phobia is exaggerated. I think the math is not as bad as it looks, but there's a lot of math in graduate programs in economics, and people are intimidated by that, and they might say, well, I'm going to go to the best school I can get into that doesn't have really, really stringent math requirements where I think I can pass. Okay, so the point is, here you're not taking Austrian economics into consideration at all in choosing your program. I want the best school that will take me so I can have the best job prospects when I get out. Again, is that the right thing to do? Well, there are pros and cons. Advantages, if it's a higher ranked school, gives you better job prospects when you get out. You're more likely to be invited to the right conferences and get to meet the right people. And there's evidence even that when you submit manuscripts to journals, journal editors pay a lot of attention to the letterhead. A submission coming from the University of Chicago is more likely to be taken seriously than a submission coming from Podunk University. There's a tremendous amount of I'll put it this way: don't underestimate how important pedigree is in academia. It may be good or bad. I think it's probably bad, but almost everything in academia is tied to where you got your PhD, who you studied under, the career path that you've gone through. And one unusual thing about academia compared to most other professions is that you can almost never move up. You can only move down, with a few exceptions. Like, for example, think about sports. I'm a big sports fan, so if you look at successful college coaches in football or basketball, right? In basketball, you can be the coach at a small school, a Division III school or a small college, and be very successful and get hired by a bigger school. And if you're successful there, you eventually get you get to be the coach at North Carolina or Indiana or whatever. You can move your way up by excelling at each level. That never happens, almost never happens in academia. When Harvard goes to hire a new professor, they don't say, well, who's the most outstanding professor, in Division II? Okay, let's try to promote somebody from the minor leagues. It's all pedigree. The top schools hire fresh PhDs who got their PhDs at another top school. Those PhDs either get tenure and are promoted, or they don't get tenure and then they try to get a job at a lower ranked school. And if you're not successful at a lower ranked school, you get a job at an even lower ranked school, and so on. Okay, it's almost impossible to move up on the merits because no one will take you seriously unless you have the proper pedigree. Okay, so choosing the strategy of going to the most prestigious school where I can get my PhD, I think, has a lot of advantages in that sense. On the other hand, it has many disadvantages, right? You may be, one is isolation. You may be the only student or faculty member who's ever heard of Mises or Rothbard. It may be depressing. You're getting picked on all the time. You don't have anyone to talk to. I think the isolation problem is not as bad now because of the web as it was, a generation ago. But still, there's no substitute for face-to-face interaction, and if you never get to just hang out and shoot the breeze with other laissez-faire types or Austrian types, it can be pretty depressing. There's also what Murray Rothbard described as the Superman problem. So the Superman problem goes like this. You're a bright young Austrian economist, and you're going to set the world on fire. Your objective is to publish the sequel to Human Action, to advance Austrian economics, to make the next major advance. But you think, well, I also got to have a job, right? So I'm not going to go to a school that has Austrians because it's not ranked high enough, and I'm not going to write an Austrian dissertation. I'm going to go to go to an Ivy League school, and do whatever I have to do to get out. So I'm going to write a mainstream dissertation to make it easy so I don't step on any toes, just until I get my PhD. Then once I am successful in getting my degree, then I will be an Austrian. I'll be an open Austrian, right? Well, okay, so you get your PhD, but then you want to get a job, right? So you hide the Austrian tendencies so you can get a good job, and okay, now I've got a job, so I'll be an Austrian. Well, I want to get tenure, right? So I got to do a little bit more mainstream research, publish some more mainstream articles. Don't use the A word, until I get tenure. Then I'll, finally come out of the closet. Well, you get tenure, but then you want further promotions, and you want to be elected to the president of some society, and you want to get promoted to full professor and get an endowed chair, and so on and so on and so on, right? And by the time you finally achieved, every professional objective you could have achieved, all the status and recognition that you have, now you're ready to jump out of the phone booth, as Clark Kent, and rip open your shirt, and there's the Superman outfit with the big letter A, on your chest. Now I'm finally an Austrian. Well, the problem is, first of all, you're probably at least 50 years old by that point. You've long forgotten what it was about Austrian economics that excited you in the first place. You haven't done any Austrian economics in all these years. You're out of touch with the Austrian literature. You haven't been to the Austrian conferences. You can't just turn it on and off like that. You can't be a stealth Austrian and then all of a sudden one day come out of the closet. It doesn't work that way. To be a successful Austrian, you got to be, I won't say all Austrian all the time, but you got to be at least a part Austrian, part of the time. So there's people who have followed this more kind of careerist path, Austrians who have chosen this path. Many of them just ceased to be Austrians, just kind of gave up on Austrianism because it was too hard to do that and have a prestigious, sort of mainstream career. So again, both of these alternatives that I'm sketching out have advantages and disadvantages, and you have to think about what will work for you. A couple of other miscellaneous issues before we throw it open for questions. One thing to think about is a lot of good economics, a lot of good research in economics is done outside of the profession of economics per se. So some students interested in Austrian economics have chosen to get advanced degrees in in business or management or law, maybe some area of applied economics, economic history, economic geography, accounting, marketing. The idea being you can do good research in Austrian economics in one of these kind of sister disciplines without facing quite so much pressure to conform to sort of the mainstream ideal. Because in these sister disciplines, there is less of a consensus about what, there is less of a hard mainstream hardcore compared to what there is in neoclassical economics. You can also think about being a researcher, a teacher, or a scholar outside of the formal university system, right? Working at some kind of a private foundation or a think tank, working in media or journalism, being a writer. A lot can be done to advance our ideas and to fight the good fight, even without being a professor at a college or a university. So don't be so narrow in that sense. A lot of the advice that I've given to Austrian students over the years on these kinds of issues, on reflection, turns out really to be just common sense. Don't argue with your professors. Okay, it's fine to raise your hand and to politely raise some objections, to what the professor says, but for goodness sakes, don't stand up in every lecture and pull out your copy of Human Action. Well, Mises says. Professors hate that. Professors like students to be engaged and questioning and so on, but professors don't like to be badgered. And I've seen many a young Austrian, and I've even done it myself, wish I hadn't, kind of be a pain in the rear end to professors. Very few professors ever change their minds. It's very rare for a professor to change his mind, to be persuaded by another professor, let alone by a student, an undergraduate or a graduate student. It doesn't happen that way. There's an old joke that says science progresses one funeral at a time, right? And what that means is, scientists rarely, if ever, change their views. The way you get what Thomas Kuhn calls a paradigm shift, right, is because, you know, there's the devotees of the main paradigm, and then there's devotees of some alternative paradigm. And this group shrinks because its members die off, and, you know, more young people are attracted to the alternative paradigm, and eventually it grows to where it becomes bigger. Okay, so I think it's important to engage those with whom we disagree, but, you know, in a polite and friendly and constructive way. And I wouldn't devote all my energies to trying to convert people. Especially when you're a student. It's better to keep your mouth shut and do what you're told, okay, if you want to be successful. So, you know, things like that if you think about them would be pretty obvious. Well, let me stop here and throw it open to comments from your own experiences, advice that you would like to share with your fellows here, or questions that you may have. What are some concerns that you guys might have? Questions regarding your own personal situations?
Two quick questions, or first quick question. The NYU curriculum,
Uh-huh.
do you have to be a NYU student or grad student, or I mean, what are the...
I don't think so. I would ask Joe Salerno. I mean, most of the faculty who participate are not NYU faculty. As far as I know, the seminar is open to the public, so if you're a graduate student at some other university in the New York area, I don't think you would be forbidden from attending and participating. But Joe Salerno is a member of that group, and he can tell you what the formal ground rules are.
Okay, a little bit harder question. What is the main difference as far as opportunities go between having an undergrad in economics and a master's in economics? Obviously, the PhD one's obvious, but between undergrad and master's, what opportunities do you open there?
You mean just by having a master's degree but not a PhD?
You know, in both the academic and the
Right.
private sector, how is it defined versus
Right.
an undergrad?
That's a good question. Let me do academic sector first. I think probably for research universities and four-year colleges, a master's degree would probably not be sufficient to get a faculty position. I mean, there's so many PhD programs, and there are hundreds of PhDs coming out every year. In fact, there's an excess supply of people with PhDs now. Universities can get them on the cheap. So it's very unusual for someone without a PhD to get a job at a four-year degree-granting institution. Now, two-year schools, community colleges and so on, do have quite a lot of faculty members who have only a master's degree. So at least a master's would probably be necessary to get any kind of a college or university teaching job, but to get a job at a four-year school, a PhD would really be required. As far as business goes, I typically advise students who just want a master's degree but want to be successful in private, you know, in the business world. I don't think a master's degree in economics adds a lot of value. I think it'd be something that you might want to do because you're intellectually curious and you enjoy it. But, you know, for example, there's much more of a salary premium put on an MBA degree than a master's degree in economics. The MA or MS in economics has really been phased out in recent years. At many universities, where I went to grad school, we didn't even have a master's program. Master's degrees as a consolation prize to people who. So everyone started out in the PhD program, and then a few people after 1 or 2 years decided they'd had enough, and so they were allowed to write a little thesis and get a master's degree and a pat on the back. But you know, not being a businessman myself, I would defer to people in the business world who could tell you how they would value one type of degree over another. And by the way, since you brought this up, on a related subject, a common question I'm often asked: if I want to go to grad school in economics, do I have to major in economics as an undergrad? And the answer there is no. In fact, there's very little premium put on undergraduate study in economics in most graduate programs. I mean, you know, between you and me, if all you wanted to do was succeed in the graduate program and get out, you know, with as less pain as possible, I'd advise you to major in math. Math and statistics majors do much better in most economics graduate programs than economics majors. I mean, it's sad but true, because of the way economics is taught at the graduate level. I mean, I had many classmates when I was an undergraduate economics major, and when I went to grad school, I had classmates who'd never taken any econ course ever. They'd never read anything in economics. I don't know if they knew what a demand curve was. I once asked one of my professors, in my program they assigned the graduate students to be teaching assistants in large undergraduate classes at the university. But I noticed that the new TAs, the graduate students who were being a TA for the first time, were always assigned to the intro econ principles class as TAs. And I asked the professor who was in charge of assigning the TAs, I said, why do we do that? Because really, if you're teaching for the first time, teaching an intro course might actually be harder than teaching, an intermediate level course where you're more on par with the students. Because, it takes pedagogical skill to be able to explain concepts to, college freshmen who've never had an economics course before. It takes more skill as a teacher to do that. I said, why not start out assigning our TAs to, intermediate micro theory or something, which they probably find easy, and then once they get some teaching experience under their belts, then assign them to teach the principles class. And he said, the reason we assign the grad students to teach, to be TAs in the intro class is so they'll learn it themselves. Because most of our grad students have never taken a principles class. We make them be TAs so they can learn what opportunity cost is and, scarcity and all that. I was shocked. I found that shocking that you would have people getting PhDs in economics who didn't know any basic economics. But I've since become more cynical, I guess. Other question of somebody over here first, and then we'll go back.
Do you think it's possible for one to embrace concurrently embrace Austrian economics and Austrian ideology, and for that person to work in a leadership position within government?
That's a hard question to answer. Now, I certainly know people who have done really good Austrian work in Austrian economics, really good economists who have had temporary positions in government agencies. One example is Morgan Reynolds, who was chief economist at the Department of Labor 3 years ago. Is a great economist at Texas A&M, frequent participant at the Austrian Scholars Conference. I know plenty of sort of Chicago laissez-faire fellow traveler types who had high-ranking positions in the Reagan and first Bush administration, and they seem to come out of it okay. I don't know of anyone who has a permanent position at a place like that. I mean, there's it's sort of a touchy area, but the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks have what they call research economist positions. They're not top, you're not really a policymaker, but there are people who, sort of half the time they work for the Fed, and the Fed allows them the other half to do their own research on whatever they want. So there are some economists employed at the Fed who are not too bad. I don't know if that's the kind of thing that you had in mind. There's an interesting article. If you've ever seen, there's a journal put out by an economist named Dan Klein, same spelling as me, Dan. Puts out an online journal called Econ Journal Watch. It's at econjournalwatch.org, I think. And the current issue just came out. I just got the email earlier this week. Has an article on the influence of the Fed and Fed funding on academic research in monetary economics, written by Larry White. Showing how, again, this institutional factor, how all the dollars that flow from the Fed in not what we think of as conducting monetary policy, but in employing research economists who write papers and publish articles, and the Fed sponsors conferences. I mean, if you're a monetary economist and you're not on the Fed gravy train, you're really missing out. And this article documents the impact that's had on the content of monetary economics research. I don't know to what extent that answers your question, but
follow up now.
Please.
Do you think it's possible, say, for one to kind of navigate the political waters of, say, running for a position like Congress or something, and still embrace Austrian ideology? Like, is it possible to do that, and then when, say, in that sort of position, try to reduce the size of the government or something to the extent possible?
Okay. Well, let me just answer briefly because that's a very big and important question. empirically, I don't think very many people have been successful at doing that. You know, are there any good people in Congress? Yeah, there's Ron Paul, who's a great hardcore Austrian libertarian, is a Republican congressman from Texas. But keep in mind that the influence that Ron Paul has is primarily as an educator, right? He has a public platform in which he can propagate our ideas. His influence is really not as a legislator, because, you know, the way the committee structure and so on works, I mean, he doesn't have positions of authority. It's funny when you look at if you look at congressional votes. Sometimes I do this, you know, whenever you have a vote that's, you know, 434 to 1, he's almost always the one. Okay, so I don't think he's had tremendous success in introducing and getting past legislation that has, you know, made the world a better place. I think his primary accomplishment has been as a public figure, really as an educator. But, you know, I'm not going to say that it's impossible, but I don't know a lot of examples like that. Please.
Wouldn't it be more professionally rewarding to pick a particular area or issue within the general field, the broad field of Austrian economics, and concentrate on that as perhaps a life's work that
Right.
you would really enjoy getting into in considerable detail, as opposed to trying to seek a position at a prestigious, so-called prestigious
Right.
university?
Yes, I think so, absolutely. And I think that you raise a very good point that I should have raised before, that I think it's important, being a professional economist or a historian or a philosopher or whatever, that, you know, you think of yourself as working on particular applied problems that are important to those within and outside the profession. It's very difficult to be a generalist. Now, one can go too far. There's a lot of hyper-specialization in academia today, which is a mistake. But what I mean is, if you're going to be an economist, you know, you're going to have some area of specialization: business cycle theory, monetary economics, industrial organization, labor economics, whatever. So my personal opinion, which may not be shared by the other faculty here, is that, you know, you're much more likely to persuade a non-Austrian economist that Austrian economics is valuable if, you know, for example, you specialize in labor economics and there's some issue or puzzle or controversy within labor economics, and you can address that issue somehow using Austrian reasoning. I think your neoclassical colleague is going to say, oh, wow, you know, you've shed some light on some real-world phenomenon that I didn't previously understand as well. You've made me understand it better. You know, how did you do this again? What's that kind of reasoning that you used? Rather than, you know, bashing people over the head with praxeology and, you know, sort of, let me explain why why your framework is fatally flawed. The proof is often in the pudding. The truth is, most mainstream economists, and I guess this is going out on the web, so I have to be careful. I'll include myself too. Most economists are not that philosophically sophisticated. Okay, most of us are really not that bright. We're kind of like plumbers. You know, you ask the typical. There's a misperception among many young Austrians, I think, that their neoclassical professors and colleagues have some sort of hardcore, deep philosophical commitment to logical positivism or something. No, it's not that at all. The typical mainstream economist has never heard the term positivism. You know, I do economics this way because this is the way I learned it in grad school, and I didn't know there was another way you could do it, and this seems like an okay way to do it to me, and here I go. Right? I mean, most economists are not interested in philosophical or methodological debate. They just they've never read anything in that area. They've never heard any of the terms. That's really not a good way to persuade most mainstream economists. On the other hand, if you can shed light on some applied problem, they're much more likely to be interested in what you have to say, in my view. Over here first, and then we'll go here.
Well, just out of curiosity, at my university, I started attending these dissertation defenses and things like that. And I've probably done like 6 of them. But 5 of them had some application game theory, and one of them was almost pure math, like topology or something. But it kind of frightened me. I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, this is a year and a half, 2 years away before I start thinking.
Right.
Then, like, I don't know, like within IO, yeah, there's lots of topics I could choose. But it's just like, I mean, like how early do you really need to start, you know, like how am I going to do this, where's it at,
Right.
where's this, I mean, it just seems overwhelming.
Right. Yeah, this is a really good question. Let me answer a couple of different aspects of your question. You know, one is you've, I think, taught us something important just in the way you asked your question. You know, if you're a graduate student, let's say in history, you know, what does a PhD dissertation in history look like? You know, what do I have to do? What will I have to do to write a dissertation? Well, I mean, for goodness sakes, go out and look at the ones that are currently being written. I mean, go to the dissertation defenses in your department. Go to the library or wherever they keep the bound copies of recent dissertations and look at them. You know, I said earlier, you know, how you should talk to other professors that you know, talk to professors here, and that's important, that's valuable. But keep in mind that we all got our PhDs, you know, 20 or 30 years ago, and so our experience in getting the PhD may not be as relevant as yours. I mean, I'd much rather tell you about the dissertation committees I currently serve on than what happened when I was a student. So let's say I've looked at dissertations in my field. I know what they look like, and they're intimidating the you know what out of me. Well, I mean, I think a dissertation, just like any other major project, you know, if you think of it all at once, it's very scary. But if you break it down into parts, if you think about breaking it down into steps, like we did with the career plan, and focus on the parts one at a time, it's a lot less intimidating or scary. One thing in particular for economists, almost all PhD dissertations in economics now are of what they call the 3 essays variety. So rather than one big, 300, 400 page treatise, very few of those are written now. What you do to get an economics PhD is to write 3 journal articles, 3 publishable articles, that are at least tangentially related to each other. And sometimes they're just barely related. Probably half the dissertations now have titles like, 3 essays in monetary economics, essay 1, essay 2, essay 3. There are a lot of advantages in doing that, by the way, namely that so few books are written in economics. There's very little reward for writing a book. People rarely read book-length treatments of problems. Economics is much more a journal article culture than a book culture. And so to be successful, you're going to have to publish articles. And so, why write a book-length dissertation and then spend the next year or two after you get finished dividing it up into little pieces you can publish as articles? Why not just write it as articles from the get-go? And then you're already ready to send them off to journals to get published. So if one were doing that, then again, thinking about, okay, I just want to have one good essay, one good paper or chapter. And then once that's done, you think about, okay, now I want another good essay or chapter, rather than thinking about, oh my gosh, having to do this whole huge monstrosity. Actually, funny story, the very famous economist Lawrence Summers, who's now the president of Harvard University. You probably have heard of him. He was chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. He was a number 2 person at the Treasury, assistant secretary of the Treasury. Anyway, the story on Summers is he attended MIT, and he's a big hot shot. I don't know if you know he's 2 of his uncles. His uncles are Paul Samuelson and Kenneth Arrow. So the guy's got a pretty good, pedigree. He's the superstar of the MIT economics department, and he finishes in 2 years or 3 years or something, and starts publishing all these articles in the top-ranked journals. Gets a job at Harvard, and I guess maybe it's when he's going up for promotion at Harvard, someone finally notices that he never actually got his PhD. He's already published articles in the American Economic Review and the Journal of Political Economy, and is already considered a rising star. And so the story, which is perhaps apocryphal, but I've been told is, so he calls up somebody at MIT and says, okay, look, just take 3 of my AER articles and put a cover page on them and turn that into the graduate school, and that'll be my dissertation. Right? So the guy never even wrote a dissertation. He just started writing articles from the beginning. And and he did all right. So, a question over here.
Jeff, when you were talking about the how kind of math, it's all matrix, right? And although it's definitely not Austrian, but it's also very challenging. I know that I go to University of Oregon, and it's the econometrics you have to take are very in depth. And sometimes you have to do research, advancing econometrics for your econ degree.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I definitely understand the rift between Austrian economics and econometrics, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about how it can be useful for an Austrian.
Yeah.
To kind of, because it's a huge sacrifice.
Sure.
To go through all that math and
Right.
say, well, I'm an Austrian, I'm not going to use it.
Right. That's a good question. The question is, what's the relationship between, is there an appropriate use of econometrics within Austrian economics? Maybe would be another way to phrase the question. There's two schools of thought on this. There's different opinions within the Austrian camp. First, let me say, I think, all Austrians are united in rejecting the sort of Friedmanite positivist view that econometrics is appropriate and necessary for testing economic theory. So none of us think you should do we have to test whether demand curves slope down or whatever. But the difference is there's some economists, I think Jeff Herbner would be in this camp, who say that econometrics really isn't useful at all for Austrians because of various inconsistencies and sort of internal errors in how econometric analysis is done, assumptions that are made in doing the analysis. Other Austrians, and I'll put myself in this camp, would say that econometrics can be useful as a tool for doing economic history. That if you have data, which all data are historical data, it may be very recent history like yesterday or last year, but if we have quantitative data on events that have already taken place, and we want to look at the strength of relationships among variables, we want to tease out patterns in the data to look at past trends and use them as a part of doing applied economics, that's perfectly legitimate. Now, even within that camp, I think people would say, wait, there is such a thing as bad econometrics or a misuse of econometrics, but the idea of doing statistical analysis on data is not inherently illegitimate if it's put in its proper place, as the handmaiden of economic theory rather than as something superior to economic theory. Let's go here and then David and then back here again.
Very simple question. How do you get published outside of academia?
Like what kind of...
well, let's say come up with a great idea. Something is perfectly unique and very relevant. And it's very Austrian. How would you get published outside academia?
Yeah. You mean published in an academic journal where you are not a professional academic, or you mean published in some other venue?
That's one of the case studies.
Well, it's very difficult to get published in the academic journals as an independent scholar. It used to not be the case. I mean, a lot of Mises was just an adjunct part-time professor at University of Vienna. His primary job was, at the Vienna Chamber of Commerce. Einstein worked at the patent office and, dabbled in relativity theory in his spare time. And those guys didn't have problems getting their work published in scientific outlets. But it really isn't like that anymore. If you're not a professor or at the Fed or something like that, most journals will probably not even read your submission. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't alternative outlets to getting things published. I mean, look, the point is that the journals, professional journals, are, it's like branding, right? I mean, gosh, I can do, if I'm interested in monetary theory, I can Google the term monetary theory and get gazillions of hits. Most of them will be, on Joe Schmo's webpage. Do I want to take the time to read every one of those? No, I probably want to do some filtering. And one of the ways I do filtering is, well, I'll just look at the essays that have gone through the filtering process of refereeing and editorial selection to get in journals. Now, of course, there's the risk that because of bias there may be systematic bias as to what gets in the journals and what doesn't. So there may be really great ideas that aren't getting in the journals. But again, there's a trade-off. I tend to read much more of what's published in the known journals acknowledging that I may be missing out on some good stuff because the opportunity cost of searching for the good stuff that's not in the journals is so high. But you know, it's a lot less expensive to publish nowadays when you can publish with a mouse click on the web. Even publishing books, you know, bound books is a lot cheaper than it used to be. But I think it's difficult to get your work publicized if you don't have an affiliation or it's not put out by a series that people are familiar with. Just there's so much stuff out there.
Just a general comment on strategy. Like I'm in the MBA program. Probably a couple of people who are. You know, if you like you're talking about, if you sort of like find something that the person's interested in, and just sort of you know, send them a link to an article or something like that. A lot of times they'll read it and they'll be interested in it, like in accounting or finance or and even things that are kind of totally unrelated, like I don't know, music. You know, there's some Austrians who analyze, you know, the effect of, you know, kind of like the pre-marketed music and stuff like that. That's an interesting strategy, you know, sort of, you know, it's very, you know, non-assuming.
Right. That's a good point. I mean, one of the stories that was told about Murray Rothbard when he got a teaching position at Nevada, Las Vegas, you know, many of his colleagues in the economics department, you know, they certainly weren't sympathetic to Austrian economics, but Rothbard was on very good terms with the dean and the provost and the president because, I mean, the guy was a genius and was so brilliant and learned and conversant in so many different fields. You know, those of you, I mean, having had the privilege of knowing him personally, I mean, imagine someone with the breadth of knowledge of David Gordon, you know, and the ability to be an original, creative thinker, produce the kind of work that he did. But, you know, you could raise any subject with Rothbard, you know, 17th century Chinese pottery, and, you know, and he would know a lot about it. And so, but your point is, you know, showing your professors that being an Austrian is part of being a well-rounded scholar and an intellectual, rather than being a very narrow technical specialist applied mathematician, which is what most economists are, might get you a lot of mileage. I think we can take one more. We're really out of time, but anyone have a quick one? Okay, well, thanks very much for coming.